Tonight I'm joined by Dan from the Board Game BBQ podcast. Dan, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you're here. Today we want to talk about sort of teaching games. You've obviously part of the Board Game BBQ with the game days. One of the big things of those game days is you have scheduled teachers. You've taught me at least one game with Aeon's End. Can you tell me a little bit about the process you go for when you want to teach a game?
When I teach games, I usually, and what I recommend to people who are teaching games, probably first and foremost is know the rules. There's nothing worse than sitting down with someone who's going to teach you a game, and then they spend the first 15 minutes with their head buried in the rules, sort of learning them themselves. So it's good to be able to be familiar with the rules, and it's okay if you're not across all of them, but to know the guts of the rules is really, really important, so you can hit the ground running with your teach. The way I like to sort of introduce a teach that we call is three things. First of all is to explain the theme. So we are merchants on the high seas and we're trying to collect loot from islands. We are astronauts in space and we're trying to explore the system. In the case of high society, we are high society people and we're bidding on luxury items. Just to try and just get the theme across right from the get-go. And also helps everyone buy in. And
I guess that's especially true when, it doesn't always happen, but when the game's theme helps to inform the gameplay.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes some games can be really thematic, and that way there's certain things that you'll explain as you explain the rules, and they go, oh, that makes sense because we're pirates, or because we're kids in a school ground and we're trying to defend the school against zombies. The
whole time I'm trying to figure out what games you're talking about.
That one was
Zombie Kids.
That one was Zombie Kids, yes. The next thing I was trying to get across is just the key objective. And sometimes there might not be a theme. So in the case of chess, the objective is to capture the king. Or in the case of Snakes and Ladders, there's no theme, but the objective is to roll dice and get from 1 to 100. So that way everyone understands, okay, I get the theme and I know what we're trying to do. And then the last thing is the win condition as well. So always be clear about the win condition from the start. So the first person to get from here to here wins the game. The first person to get to X wins the game. After 4 rounds, whoever has the most money or the most victory points wins the game. Before you get into all the sort of nitty-gritty on different pieces and different mechanics and things like that, you always try and hit what the theme of the game is, what we're all trying to do, what the objective of the game is, and how you win. There's nothing worse than getting to the end of a teach, and then someone goes, oh, and by the way, how do I win? And they go, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you that. So you need to make sure that Always try and cover it at the start. And you can always circle back to it at the end as well.
I've been a bit guilty of when it's everyone learning the game at once, and like you're trying to learn and teach at the same time, which is not ideal, as you were saying.
Yeah.
But sometimes if, it's a brand new game, you don't have a choice, is getting to the end of the game and be like, oh, so and now we're storing this. And people go, that's part of the win, and that's always something you got to
If I'd known that half an hour ago, I would have started collecting them.
Yeah.
So just things like that, particularly if it is around, because there's some games that we would call like a point salad game where there's multiple ways to actually collect points. So if they understand the different ways you can collect points, then they can focus on whatever they want to focus on during the game.
Which also, I guess, opens up their idea about think about the strategy of how they're going to play.
Yeah. Sometimes there's some games that really lend themselves to breaking the teach down into phases, and so you can explain part of the game and then go, there's this part of the game I'll explain when we get to it. There might be certain phases or certain rounds in which other things are introduced to the game, and that's good because you don't have to cover everything off right at the start. You can sort of get to that when you need to. And I'm trying to think of a game like Quacks and Quiddling Bird, where you start off with some key ingredients on the table that everyone has, but there's other ingredients that introduce themselves during the game. You don't need to cover those ones off at the start. You can cover that. So those sorts of things can actually help you and make the teach shorter, so that everyone can get on with playing the game.
So make sure you have a good overview of the game, of the theme, of how you're going to potentially win. Try to break it down so it's not just hair.
Yeah. It's funny because I always used to forget about the theme, and it's actually Def from the Board Game BBQ podcast he really does a really great job of explaining the theme first, and it's amazing how much that actually does sort of sink in and does sort of set the tone for the game as well. Yeah, so they're sort of the three things that I try and hit on when I teach games.
Yeah, I remember watching a Shut 'em and Sit Down video with, I can't remember the order they did it, but they're like a brief overview of the game, which includes like the theme, like how you win, and then why you like the game, to sort
Yeah.
of try and get people engaged in
Yeah.
the teach, being like, oh, I really like High Society because the currency is limited, so how you bid actually really matters because you can't put down a 5 and get the 3 back. You've got to build off that 3 that you've already put down.
There's nothing better than learning a game from someone who is really passionate or excited about the game. And that's one of the luxuries that we have at the Board Game BBQ when we have our game days, because there's so many of us and we have a team of volunteers as well, that we generally teach games that we love. And then it's easier for people who are new to the game to sort of buy into it because they can see that we're really passionate about the game. We get really jazzed to teach it and introduce it to new people. If someone's just teaching a game that they're not familiar with or they're not a big fan of, it's harder for everyone else to enjoy it as well.
So what have you learned when since jumping on with Board Game BBQ, and so you guys have been doing the game days for a while now, what have you learned in that process where you're not necessarily teaching friends or family, you're teaching strangers who don't know what their game play is, what their experience is like? What have you learned there?
Probably the biggest thing I've learned through being on the podcast and sort of being exposed to so many more games through all the other sort of the rest of the team is understanding the different kinds of mechanics that there are in games and tailoring them to people who are sort of new to the game. So asking them what kind of games they're familiar with. Some people grew up playing card games with their family, and so that does lend to games that involve cards or deck building games or trick taking games because they're already familiar with some of those concepts. People that are familiar with sort of Monopoly, okay, it can be a bit of a dirty word in the hobby, the M word, but they're familiar with bidding. They're familiar with sort of mechanics of auctions and bidding mechanics and things like that. So, and then kind of tailoring it to. So if someone does they do want to learn a game, I can sort of go, well, what games are you familiar with? What games are you interested in? And I can tailor a game to them. So I can try and get on the front foot and pick a game that they're going to enjoy.
Which I guess works for like people who are more in the hobby. When you look at Dune Imperium and be like, okay, well, here's the worker placement elements, here's the deck building placements, here's the combat stuff, and now we're going to tie it all together.
Yeah.
And when you can lean off those already learned skills from other games, it becomes a bit easier to do those.
Yeah, exactly. With a game like that, where it has different mechanics, if you sort of, as you say, explained what they're familiar with first, with the deck, with the cards and things, they go, okay, I get that. Now you can introduce the next part of it without overwhelming them. Whereas if they're not familiar with any of those mechanics, it'd be quite overwhelming to see there's 4 different things all going on at once in that game.
Final question, Dan. Can you tell me what's sort of been your favourite game to teach, and what is something that you've really struggled to teach?
It's funny, one of the games that I taught you, Aeon's End, which is one of my favourite games, found that difficult to teach only because there is quite a few different things going on. As much as I love it, and sometimes when you're overly familiar with the game, you sort of take for granted some of the things that you think are easy, but maybe the other people that are sitting at the table for the first time don't find particularly easy. Some of my favourite games to teach are just party games. So big hit at PAX recently was So Clover, Just One. Some of those style games where once everyone gets it, everyone's sort of working together, and it's almost like the scoring doesn't matter. Everyone's there to have fun. You just play as long as you want to play. They're probably some of the most fun games to teach because they are so easy to pick up, and everyone just has a blast.
Dan, thank you very much for coming on and chatting about teaching games.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.